What's up? We back. I'm back. That's John Corbin on the intro and outro again for season 4. Welcome to the author's edition. I am Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 lands in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. This episode, I'm excited to share with you. It's one episode, but it's going to be longer, just under 1 hour, with my friend, Rev Dr. Dennis Edwards. Dennis and I met in Philly at a church planting conference, and I knew a little bit about him and checked out his talks that he shared. And what struck me, and what strikes me with a lot of academics who are pastors or were pastors at one point, there's just a different level of connection, I've found at least. And so I value that connection with Dr. Edwards. In this episode, we are going to talk about his book, Might from the Margins, on the second half of it. But on the first half, we're going to talk a little bit about his story as an academic and also as a pastor and what it looks like, or what it used to look like, to try the kick at the can, as it were, to usher in a church or lead a church into a multi-ethnic setting. It didn't work out, and we'll explore why it didn't. I think the honesty in his experience as a pastor lends credit to his words and also credit to the scholarship that he does. We'll talk about that on the second half as well. Without further ado, enough from me. Let's jump in and meet Dr. Edwards. Yeah, I was in Chicago before pandemic.
Okay.
I don't think it was, it would have been like the fall 2019 for, what was it called? Liberating Evangelicalism?
Yes, you were
or
there?
something like that. Yeah.
I was there too. And
How did I miss you?
Yeah, I'm saying it because it wasn't a huge crowd, but it was a good sized group. I remember Vince Bontu gave a talk and I was like, Vince, he was like, whoa. Angela Parker, these are people I know because she's New Testament also. Reggie Williams, I know he was there. I did a small workshop that actually was the early stages of some of the thoughts on Might from the Margins. I called it Power to the People, and I did a workshop there. So yeah, I was there. That was actually a good gathering.
Yeah, it was. It's always a miss to not be able to see everyone. All the faces you see on social media.
Right. Well, I'm glad you were there though, because I think we needed that kind of, and I think we're still getting it, but needed to have those voices that were decentering some of the white evangelical voices. Yeah.
I went down because we're doing this work, obviously, in Canada, but it's different. It's different. It doesn't have the same posture. It doesn't have the same amplified voice. There's not as many people, but it's also in some ways further ahead, at least in the decolonizing side, in terms of reclaiming back to an education of the land. So an indigenous spirituality, an indigenous land-based teachings. There's more of that, I think, going on. Less influence from a historic black and brown church in Canada, which is in many respects non-existent, especially out west where I am.
Okay. I think I can understand that. I would be curious at some point, even to learn more, because after ministering in Minnesota, became more aware of indigenous voices that in DC I didn't really hear from as much. And I just feel like you Canadians have a lot to teach us there. And but anyway, it was on the radar, but I don't know. I want solidarity, with our indigenous brothers and sisters, but I don't know what that looks like in some places if there's not a strong enough black presence, but anyway, that's just something to explore down the road, I think. But I feel like it's coming. I feel like we're moving in that good direction.
I wonder how much, in many respects, COVID has reminded those who were kind of in the middle, let's say anti-Asian racism, for example, of that picture of solidarity, which may have not been there before, but suddenly there's more, there's an alert or a growing awareness in the contemporary world that you can't just hide as a person of color. that you
Yes.
have to now be drawn into the same fight, as it were,
Yes.
or
Yes.
claim the fight towards liberation.
That's a good word. Okay, I'm hearing that. Yeah, it's funny because I was just talking to some folks yesterday that when I saw the Asian American Christian Collaborative growing and developing, and then
Mm-hmm.
taken to the streets here in Chicago for Black Lives Matter, that was I was excited. I was grateful because that's a new move in my lifetime. I mean, I come up in an era where I've been a city guy, grew up in New York, and lived in D.C. And there was a lot of tension with, say, Asian shop owners. Well, you remember the Spike Lee movie, Do the Right Thing. There's this stereotype of Black folks in the city having pressure with Asians who have businesses in the city but live outside of those communities. And we should have had more solidarity. And I feel like we lost something. But so now I see the Christians are at least making good moves. I feel good moves to build together, build something new together. And COVID, like you said, has kept us in a way avoiding the issues, and we have to confront things. So I'm hopeful actually for a new sense of community, at least with Asian Americans and African Americans, and certainly Latina Americans. Yeah.
Yeah, I have the same sense. I mean, you certainly offer more perspective of what has happened in the past and how that is different. Like every generation seems to be reiterating the same things, and you can read Dr. King today and realize nothing has changed in 60 years. And so in some ways you can feel as though we're stuck, but then the Asian piece is there. That's the piece of the demands of whiteness in many respects, of the demands to assimilate. And if you're
Yes.
in that middle for Asians, you can just keep your head down. That's very Japanese. Keep your head down like a turtle, poke it out once in a while, but just work. And maybe you will be afforded the benefits of whiteness. And then
Yeah.
COVID comes in to remind all these Asians who don't look anything Chinese, right? But, Chinese enough that you come with the terms and conditions too, and you just happen to forget about that.
Wow. That's deep though. But I was seeing that. I mean, and obviously our president down here exacerbated all of that, and now still there's backlash on Asians. But the way you said it is, I mean, I can't speak from that perspective, but the idea of like sort of putting your head down and going at it. But I've seen African Americans who've tried to assimilate that way too, and say, look, I'm just going to do the best I can. I'm going to put my head down, do my work, and if I'm good, whatever that means, I can stay I can avoid any issues and trouble. And that doesn't happen either. I mean, because you get pegged, stereotyped, you still get pulled over by the cops. I mean, all that kind of stuff happens. So yeah, I mean, you said it well.
I want to give a little bit of intro now, a little bit of also your experience, because you're in a unique space in that you're an academic, you teach New Testament, but you also, I think you still hold credentials, right? But you have a lot of experience as a lead pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Is that right?
Yes, that's most recently. I am credentialed in the Evangelical Covenant Church. That's right.
Let's talk first about your work as a pastor, because, and I want to dig in just a little bit with it, but there's some good work, some attempts around leading multiracial chururs.
Right.
And that was your experience in D.C.?
Yes, yes.
How long ago was that?
That was I went to D.C. at the beginning of 95. In fact, my first Sunday was January 1, 1995. So that's a while ago. Prior to that, I was a church planter in New York. I'm from New York City. And so, I mean, I'll just tell you real quickly, my journey is very circuitous. I think the issue was me trying to find a home, a theological and ecclesiological home where I could be myself. And I didn't grow up in a very stereotypical African-American church, because I probably would have just stayed there. But I wound up, the short version is in my college years, met up with some white evangelicals. So I visited around different churches, attended an African-American Baptist church. but I didn't really sense my own call to ministry until a little later. And by that time, it was a white pastor, an Evangelical Free Church pastor, who told me I should go to seminary. Now, he told me I should go to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and that's the denomination with the Evangelical Free Church. He hadn't gone there, but he felt like that would be good for me. I wasn't sure, but right around that same time, there was an African-American pastor new to the Evangelical Free Church who was getting a lot of press here in Chicago, as a matter of fact. So I thought, well, maybe there is a place for me as an African-American in this denomination. So I went to Trinity. I did well there. And the church I attended on the west side of Chicago had made a name for itself in being, I think at the time we were using the language of multiracial. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I'd like to see something like this in New York. So I went back to New York to plant a church. Didn't know anything about planting church. The denomination wasn't given any money, although they would like publicize you, like put your name out there to different churches and in the denomination publications. And my picture was there, my wife and I and our little children. So there was a little bit of publicity, but no money. So I went back to teaching school and everything. So we planted a church called New Community. And New Community struggled we didn't have any money. I'm teaching school, all of that. But that was my first attempt at multi-ethnic. I think that's the word we use now. And in New York, it certainly fit. Multi-ethnic ministry, then DC, then Minneapolis. Yeah. So yeah, that was my first experience. And then I went to DC. I served a church that was founded by Mennonites. So I shifted my credential and I got ordained in the Mennonite church. I became the lead pastor there. But that I talk about in my book. That's where a lot of my real stark issues with race and power came into play. Yeah. And then we planted another church called Peace Fellowship in a different part of DC. And I did that, was there for 11 years before I went to Minnesota. And I ended my pastoral career in Minnesota and became a full-time professor.
Let's stick to DC here and your experience, because I think it's worth hearing, because now fill in the blanks for me. There was an ideal or perhaps a hope, do you think, of trying to find unity in racialized diversity?
Yes. Well said. When I learned about the position, this church on Capitol Hill, I learned about it through one of John Perkins' old publications. They were advertising about this church. I applied, and friends of mine said, look, Dennis, churches take a long time to make a decision. I got a call like within a week of sending my stuff, and the pastor said, we'd really like to talk to you. And I'm not naive. I knew part of it is because I'm Black, and it's DC. DC was called Chocolate City. I mean, DC was a majority Black city. So when I got to interview, and this, of course, before the social media and all, computer and all that stuff. So I had to physically go down to DC. And when I went down to DC and met with the search committee, I was impressed that they had this church in the city with resources, with a building, and trying to connect with its neighbors. So I thought, man, of course I would want to be part of this. Yeah. I knew I was a racial minority at the church, but the rhetoric, the language was that we wanted to be a church for our community, for our city. And we know we're all mostly white. In fact, even in the description of the church, they mentioned the percentage of African Americans who come to the church, which I thought was interesting to put in the descriptor of the church. And I still remember it was 6% African Americans. So at a church of about 400, that meant 24 or so people are Black or African American.
That's not a lot.
And no, not a lot. In a city that's, at the time was like 70% African American. So I knew there were challenges, but the overture to me was that you could help us be better representative of our community.
Yeah. I guess we'll skip the middle. How did that go?
Well, the weird part about it was, if I'm really honest, the masses of people, young adults, I don't want to overstate it, but they really loved me. I had a good, warm connection with so many people and that was as the associate. And the lead pastor went on to go, he had as a PhD, so he went on to go teach someplace while I was actually doing my PhD studies at the same time. But he went off to go teach. So there was this weird place where I was the associate, didn't think I fit there because the pressure I was having was from leadership, not from the masses of people in the pew who liked my preaching. They liked me as a person, like my family. and not just like, I mean, I think they respected, but people in power were seeing that the church was changing, that there was different energy. I'm an amateur musician. I'm not very good, but I'm a decent woodwind player. So I used to have a praise team that I put together, and my praise team, we had different musicians, so we take turns. We had probably about 5 or so different praise teams that would take turns leading worship. And my praise team got a lot of excitement because I brought a diversity of voices and people to the team. That got pushed back. Something as simple as that. I mean, it was like my presence and the way of doing ministry was challenging the status quo of some white folks, whereas the masses of people were loving it. So the short version of a really long story is that it was the power folks that really had a hard time with me. I got voted in to be the lead pastor after the other guy left, and that's when it really got tough. Some of the power folks, they started leaving the church, which sent some anxiety to the people managing the budget and whatnot, and they were feeling like Dennis is pushing people away. White folks from the suburbs were saying, there's no place for us. Dennis only cares about the city. That's actually a quote. Dennis only cares about the city. There's no place for us. Like it's, like God's table isn't big enough. And so with all that anxiety, I couldn't get anything done. So I actually resigned. And that was really tough.
Yeah. I wonder, and this is going to be a loaded question, but I wonder, I mean, you went through a space where the intent was there to try to embody something better. Do you think it's possible? I mean, all things are possible, right? But do you think that because the church as a whole are so deeply racialized, that finding a space that is indeed truly multi-ethnic is darn near impossible?
Yeah, if 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I certainly would have said, no, of course, this is the way it's supposed to be. I rejected what the church missiologists people were calling the homogeneous unit principle, HUP, that the churches grew best as homogeneous units. I was rejecting that. I have come to a place where I don't embrace that. I still don't. I want to believe, and I still believe that a multi-ethnic church is healthy, or can be healthy, and can model the kingdom of God. However, I have these howevers about how we deal with power and privilege, and that was the area that never got addressed. We were always talking about proximity, about getting us in the same room, and then taking a beautiful picture and putting it on the brochure of people sitting next to you. But we never really reckoned with power and privilege. Now I hear people talking about power and privilege. So I think if we can get to the place where white folks will sit and listen, and people with means realize that their money doesn't buy them place in church or in glory, if we can figure out a way, and I think there's movement here, to deal with power and privilege, then I think we can talk about the real multi-ethnic church.
That's a good word. I wonder, I don't know, part of me is cynical that any predominantly white church is capable of becoming diverse. I don't think that you can.
Yeah, I don't think that's the movement. You know what I'm saying? I think there's got to be a lot of white churches divesting themselves of that.
And I don't know if they would do that. I think they can become anti-racist, but I don't think they can become diverse.
Right. That's a good word. I think I agree with you.
And I would wonder, in all the attempts of multi-ethnic, I don't think a white man can lead that. And that's a blanket statement. And everyone needs to contend with the power systems of white supremacy, whether you're white or not.
Right.
So I could embody the same things.
That's right.
But I don't think you have, as a white male or even a white woman, that you have the cultural depth to lead properly in multi-ethnic settings.
Oh, I agree with you, and it does sound hard because I do have white friends who have really done a lot of good work, a lot of good homework, and I commend them for that. But many of them would even say that doesn't make them necessarily equipped to be pastor to this multi-ethnic group. Now, I used to hear that all the time. I had white pastor friends who would say, "Oh, my church is like the United Nations," And I said, United Nations has like one white guy up front and a few smattering of people of color inside.
Yeah.
And I would hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And I think from their perspective, just the fact that any non-white people came in was like a really big deal. But again, it didn't deal with power. It didn't deal with privilege.
Mhm.
So I tend to agree with you. I think that what I'm seeing is that white folks said, hey, white pastors were like, come on, please come to our church and basically, assimilate. And now I think the challenge that they're facing is that, people of color, we don't want to, not all of us want to assimilate. So the question is, will you white people come and defer to non-white leadership? That is not a lot of that.
The other way. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't really imagined that direction. I always picture what the third way, what the new way could be. But yeah, to come into the quote unquote minority space.
But coming into that space without an expectation of being in charge. And see, because that's also an issue, because you might be familiar with Corey Edwards. I don't think we're related, but Corey Edwards, the sociologist, has a book called The Elusive Dream. And she talks about how in multiracial churches, even if you have pastors of color, they tend to still defer to whiteness because, if white folks are not satisfied with what's happening, they'll walk. And so she basically asserts that the church can be multiracial only to the extent that white people want it to be. So they're still exercising power, even though the leadership is somebody of color.
Yeah,
so that's the challenge to me, is how will you be there as a white person?
There's so much unlearning to do, especially including for Christians of color. You're a professor of New Testament. Where are you? Because you were at Northern. Where are you now?
That's right. I'm at Northpark, which is in Chicago, and it's related. It's where the seminary of the Evangelical Covenant Church.
Okay.
So it's kind of in line with my ordination, my credential, and I already knew people here, and I was happy to come and be part of Northpark. Yeah.
Why New Testament? What drew you into that? Why New Testament?
I told you earlier that I grew up in a church that was like a non-traditional African-American church. It wasn't like the mainstream big denomination. I grew up in a little fringe, charismatic church that the denomination would call itself apostolic. It might not be so little and fringe anymore, but they were then. So theologically, it was very confusing. I'll just say real quickly, they didn't believe in a Trinity. There's just oneness, Jesus only. You had to be baptized in the name of Jesus and had to speak in tongues to be saved. These were not like special gifts. If you didn't have all of that experience. So I got baptized, all of that. I didn't speak in tongues right away. So I was like a problem. I didn't fit the paradigm. I was going to church and faithful and all that. But the short version of a very long story is that I was confused theologically. So I wanted to know the Bible as best I could. So when I finally started doctoral studies, I honestly thought I was going to pursue the Old Testament because I was always intrigued by the Old Testament. But the programs that I was after were going to make that just actually way too long. That would have to do more Semitic language. I already had Hebrew. I had some Aramaic. They said I had to take yet another Semitic language. So I just emphasized New Testament for pragmatic reasons at first. Sure. But as I got into it, I started realizing, I couldn't find that many African-American scholars who were doing biblical studies. So I was happy to stay there.
Yeah, that was one of the pieces I recollect from seminary for myself, and it was totally by chance, was I never had a woman professor, but I had a Cree man, a theologian, and Congolese systematic theologian shape and form me, which at the time I didn't realize how different that was.
Yeah, it's unusual.
And how unusual it is. And so to have your voice and within evangelical spaces in the New Testament, that's rare.
It is rare. And I didn't readily take that title evangelical, except I knew the denominations I was around had it in the title. I I didn't even think much of it. It was just this word, But
it's just a word.
It seemed that way to me until now. Of course, not just now, but I was kind of my concern with people who denied certain tenets of the faith, like the literal resurrection of Jesus, or things like that. So at Trinity, they would just classify anybody as liberal that didn't, and that wasn't a helpful word for me either. But there were certain denials that I didn't want to wrap myself around. So I didn't know where I wanted to affirm. And so I got my doctorate at a Catholic university that in practice affirmed, the resurrection of Jesus, affirmed some basic things that I believe. So I felt pretty comfortable there, even though there's still historical critical arguments about, details about scripture and such. That's all cool with me. It was more that I wanted to be around people who actually believed in Jesus. And so I didn't find a lot of African-American scholars who were that I could know personally, that could help me in the journey. And I also went part-time. I didn't get a chance to pack up and go to Europe and not get it done, or get a full ride and do it at, Harvard or Princeton or something. I would have loved to, but it took me 9 years altogether to do that doctorate. So I'm the working man's scholar. I know what it's like, Yeah, exactly. And in that process, I didn't get to meet as many mentors as I wished.
I want to talk about your book, the latest one, Might from the Margins, the Gospel's Power to Turn the Tables on Injustice. That's a lot of words in there that you don't typically see in an evangelical book. Maybe we shouldn't classify it as that, but that's not your first book. You have, I think, multiple books, but one on 2 Peter, I think?
On 1 Peter.
1 Peter.
Yep. And then a small book on the Bible called "What is the Bible and How Should We Understand It?" That's in a Anabaptist series of books called The Jesus Way. And it's one of the series. Yeah. So those are the books that I've got out right now. And thank you for recognizing.
Why 1 Peter?
Well, I did my dissertation work in James, and in that process, I had occasion to look over 1 Peter. And the reason that James is because of the justice kind of stuff that was going on, that goes on in that book, So I thought that I would. I wound up working through that book and having to look over at 1 Peter a lot, partly because they both address the people in the diaspora, which is not a common term in the New Testament. So because that's there, I went back and forth. Looked a lot at 1 Peter. Well, by the time this commentary series was coming out, I actually was approached about writing on 1 Peter. And I asked, has James been taken? Because I thought, wow, I've done a lot of work in James. And they had already assigned James to a different scholar. So I said, but 1 Peter would be my next choice. So I'm excited to get into it, partly because similar themes of justice, of following the way of Jesus in difficult situations, and this notion of being a member of the dispersion. Those themes are in James. They're also in 1 Peter.
Let's springboard from diaspora and flow right into Might from the Margins. One of the things in your book right off the bat, which I don't know if I've ever read, and it was your line on "This book centers marginalized people," like that. This is who I am writing to, and to make note of that and distinction. I noticed it.
I appreciate that.
You're speaking to me. I said, I better notice. He's calling me out right here, page 2.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's funny because when we have these conversations, I say we as Christians now, that we, and get into stuff about race and class or power, privilege, white folks, of course, assume that everything's about them. So the question that almost always comes right away is, well, what do you want me to do? And all the, and I had been in, oh my goodness, umpteen workshops in my lifetime and all these spaces. And that's always the question. And then when you say what should be done, then there's resistance. Like, my family didn't own slaves and, all that kind of stuff. So you go through all of that. And I say, you know what? I'm kind of tired of feeling like the goal is to get white people to do something different or be different. What I'd like to do is see the rest of us say, we're not waiting for that change to happen.
Yes.
We're not waiting for white folks to get it.
No.
We have work to do. And we have a gospel that is empowering. We don't need to get our power from white people. So that was the strategy.
Yes. You did use, and I made note of this, but now you answered it because of the James Peter reference of why you're using diaspora Christians instead of. So I know, say, Cone and those before, you may have actually referenced, I don't remember who, it wasn't Cone, but they would use terms of the disinherited.
Yes.
The disinherited can understand, the marginalized people, Christian, can be drawn into the effects and the experience of the cross. Because of their, but you use the terms of diaspora. Are you leveraging out of your work in James and
Yes,
exactly.
Yep. You're catching that, because I think that marginal status could, maybe in First Peter and in James, it's not a literal geographic distancing, right? So maybe it's not. But the point is, they use that language of geographic distancing to describe the feeling and the situation of their audience. Whether it's literal or not is really not the point. The point is, that word captures an alienation. It captures a distance. It captures this feeling that I don't really fit in. And that feeling is true of immigrants. It's true of people who were brought here as enslaved Africans. And also in your country, I think it would also fit indigenous people, because even though it's their land, they've been made to feel like they're the diaspora, like they're made to feel like they're the alien when the land was there. So we have this sense that whiteness and European powers have created this sense of alienation and distancing and marginalization, disinheritance, if you will, that I said, let's speak from that space. Yeah.
You use that, and now it makes so much sense. I'm glad that we teased that out and connect that now that not merely the term, but its context extends so much wider, because diaspora in this way, you are using all the different or however many other intersections it includes.
Yes. Thank you. You're seeing that. There's a just since my book came out, it was probably around maybe just right before it. I didn't get to incorporate, but Willie Jennings has a commentary in the book of Acts, and in there he has a section where he talks about early on, like in his intro, about this notion of being diaspora, and it's just this powerful quote. But the essence of it is how frail and fragile the life of folks in the diaspora situation is when compared to the empire. He says something like, your existence is only measured in terms of how beneficial you are to the empire. Well, marginal people get that, right? Marginal people get that. And immigrants get that, women get that. It's like, you're only measured in terms, your value is only in terms of what you can produce for the empire. So when he said that, I'm like, yes, he's catching what I'm trying to say, because it's that kind of distinction that's made, yes, in the New Testament. And I also think it has been happening in our world with imperialism and colonialism, that those who have formerly been colonized need to band together to say what we have learned as people of God in our marginal status is actually better representative of the way of Jesus than the way the power people have been trying to show us Christianity.
Oh boy. As you were speaking, I'm just connecting the dots here and realize in my own writing, my own book that I'm trying to put together, that motif I'm going to have to draw into the intersections of power systems, because we have one now in the empire, used empire language. Right. And it's the exact same relationship that we have in present day with a capitalist system, where your value as a person is measured in your utility in production to that system. Exactly. And it'll eat you out and spit you out.
Right, it'll eat you up and spit you out. And to say, how is that the way of Christ? But if your church is born out of that world, then that's the way you measure success. That's the way you measure faith. I mean, it's what we're seeing with 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 even down here with the Republican Party, and I'm not really trying to talk partisan stuff, but what we're seeing is the folks who champion typical sort of capitalistic American way of being have baptized that as Christian.
Yes.
And I'm like, but our first century forebears would have not said that, and oh yeah. So I know America's not Rome, but at the same time, isn't there a Christianity that should transcend those things? And I think that's what marginalized people show us, is that the way of faith transcends your those power systems that humans produce. Yeah.
There's a tweet. Yeah, we there's a word for that. We call it the Protestant work ethic. Yeah, how's that going?
Exactly.
It's working out for some people, hey? Some people get it.
It works out.
They're getting real good.
But they think that it's born out of your effort. And I'm like, my goodness, the hardest working people in the world are not in capitalist countries. They're not in, they might not even be Protestant. I mean, the people in these developing countries who work hours and hours a day, who are showing all kinds of determination and grit. And we say, oh no, really the successful person is the person who's spending, 20 hours a week playing golf and having other people work for them. And that becomes the model of faith and success.
It's broken.
Oh man, you're not kidding. It's broken. And I know the Lord knows it's broken. So I don't want to speak from any self-righteous way. The Lord knows it's broken, but I think he's working through the folks who have been pushed to the side to say, here's what the better way can look like. And I want to be part of that, that this better way of the faith, which is like the way of Jesus, is not going to come from the top down power broker way of being. And I just want to be part of that thing that God's doing.
Amen. Amen. We got to get into your chapter. You use the power motif, the power of God, of diaspora people, the power, and you have one on worship. I was just recently preaching, my whole past year has been a lingering in lamentation, in lament. We have such poor formation, at least in my church experience, around lament. It's praise and worship, not lamentation. That's what we call it, right? And COVID, the pandemic, the calls for justice have all been reasons to just stay in this season of lament as we enter in another Lent season, lamentation. And the book of James, as I was preaching on Sunday, says that God sides with those who mourn, and you have a chapter now on a mode of worship. And I'm not sure, you did draw in lamentation, but you use the words of worship as a mechanism unto justice. And that's not something we have practices around. Forming worship experiences as a mechanism and expression of justice. Unpack this for us.
Well, I will try. I think my model has been what the experts have said about enslaved Africans in America when we consider, say, like the spirituals. So you've got these songs born out of pain, and they weren't just to make the workday go by. It was also to say something about the character of God and about there being a life beyond this life, right? So that sense of being able to denounce injustice and to affirm the delivering power of God came through those songs. Even Du Bois had a big discussion on the slave songs, I think, as he called them. So my point was to say worship is this expression of what ought to be, not just how I'm feeling today or just how, happy God, as somebody called them, Jesus, my boyfriend songs. It's there's a sense of of the justice comes out because we're singing about what ought to be and what God, how God is in the world. And then we try to model that with our lives. So the prophets got after this, right? I don't care about the festivals and the feasts. The Lord said all this. I want justice to roll down. I want righteousness to flow like a waterfall. I mean, that's the way of being. That's the way of worship, right? So the songs are part of it, but the songs reflect something. They're reflecting this justice-oriented God who wants his people to live in this way, of affirming who he is and how he works in the world. So yeah, that's what I was trying to say in there. And I know we get hung up on the stylings and all those things. I'm so old now that I've been in so many different contexts that now I'm not super old, but I've been around long enough that I have seen, oh my goodness, low church, high church. I mean, I've been in a lot of different contexts. So to me, it's not so much the form. It's that if your forms are where you stop and that's what you focus so much on, then I think you're missing the real way of the power of worship is in this justice-oriented way of life that I think the prophets talk about, and I would say even in the New Testament it's talked about. Yeah.
We don't have the formation, I think, to reimagine worship beyond the songs.
Yes, thank you. Well said.
We don't have the picture of high or low church, and this is, and dare I say it, what COVID has provided is an opportunity for us to at least reimagine what that Sunday morning is. Because the centers, whether you're high, low, liturgical, contemporary, doesn't matter. You have the same stuff, and it's a prayer, 5 songs, announcements, and then someone preaches for 30 to 45 minutes, and you wrote like 52 weeks of a year, and we have no formation to imagine anything beyond singing.
Oh my goodness, you captured it, and as I mean, you said it, and I guess when I was younger and first felt the call to ministry, I rejected it because I thought, my goodness, that responsibility of being up in front of everybody and saying, "Thus says the Lord," But then as time went on, I started realizing, okay, I embraced that part of it. But even as time went on, I realized, but this isn't it. Right. I mean, it's not, but every church I planted 2 churches, but the churches that I worked for, all this energy goes into Sunday, because that's the day, right? That's got to pay the bills that day. We got to get people to keep coming back there. And maybe people will, get converted that day too. So it's good. I mean, we hope for that. But at the same time, it's almost like we don't know how to help people. The word formation you is so important because we don't know we didn't know how to help people to say, this is one expression of your whole way of life. We come together this day, but this is one piece of your whole way of being. I think more people are seeing that.
We need to be okay with trying different things, and that's the blank slate, I think, that's in front of us, especially as Sunday mornings have been pushed away or pushed online. Like And ironically, Cypher Church and how we've embodied worship. One time we did the songs and the preaching, but other times we've just tried to embody different things, movement, dance, spoken word, poetry, writing.
Oh, that's awesome.
All of these, and we'll switch it up every week, but in these pandemic times, we've done the opposite end of the spectrum where we just are trying to hold some sense of being online and having simple prayer and a word, and that's it. Which I think in this world is if that's all you got, that's okay. But if you're trying to replicate Sunday with the online band and through the screen and so forth, your imagination is being stuck. Something is preventing it from thinking of greater and grander things of where God is at work in our neighborhood, city, and beyond.
Yeah, well, my heart is with you all. I'm not pastoring right now. I'm full-time as a professor, and my heart is with all of you church leaders because it's hard to know how to manage this pandemic. But I do think what you're getting, at least how I'm hearing you, is that there's this weird and maybe unique opportunity to be creative in a sense of just thinking outside of what has always been and not trying to replicate what we've always done and just throw it online. I'm hearing you say this is a chance to try to get to the core of who we are and what we're about, and not just the forms of it. So I find something refreshing in that.
And to test, I mean, So, I mean, I did throw this out there that this is the time and so forth. And then some folks did chime back in and say, listen, all I'm trying to do as a pastor right now is survive. I have no energy to imagine
Right, exactly.
anything. And you know
Yeah,
what? That
I
there's,
hear that.
yeah, I hear that too. And so maybe I got to write up on something. Well, the final thought, I think, as I pull out your book here, as we linger around the embodied space, just how we can embody Christ in the spirit of activity of justice.
Yes.
Your book here says worship can be protest. It can be subversive. Now, I know we just spoke about the forms and so forth, but and you gave an example of the spirituals. What does protest and subversive worship look like?
Yes. So I take one quick example I'll think of in the old time, and then I'll try to make it connect to the present time. So you take the Palm Sunday incident, right? Jesus comes into Jerusalem. I call that a public protest. I call that a subversive act because he's flipping the script. He's not on the big white horse. He's coming on the donkey. We see that. But then also all these things happen that agitate the power brokers. You got people who are yelling, Hosanna, and they're telling him to silence the crowd, and he says no. And then he goes into the temple after that. And Matthew's gospel tells us he goes into the temple and he heals folks who didn't have full access into the temple. And right after that, he blesses the children. So it's like he's messing with everybody's stuff, in this day. And so he's riding in as this kind of king. He's healing folks. So when I say worship is subversive and countercultural, is that we have made it be about, hey, look how great we are. Look how sharp we can do things. Look how powerful and rich we are. And instead, maybe what we're saying is, it's when we see the young folks saying Black Lives Matter and are standing in the face of injustice and making public protests, maybe there's a way that the church can say, you know what? We have a voice to raise here too. And worship means that we're going to celebrate who God is and God's affirmation of God's creation. So that means we at times take it to the streets. It means at times we have to hear the voice of the children, like that Matthew passage, or we spend ourselves for the poor, is the way Isaiah would say it. So that's what I mean by subversion. It undermines the typical way of doing things and says that there's a Jesus way of doing it that brings the power from under and from the sides and not from the top, and so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I mean by that. I don't know, what that means for people's budgets in church or how they're going to do their Sunday service. But if they could at least come to the table with those ideas, then I say, then the creative juices can start. I mean, if you can get your leadership or however you structure churches on the same page to say, you know what, this is what our end goal is to see our community blessed, to see transformation, to see these. If that's the end goal, then how do we shape what we're doing now to get there, right? And I feel like we've almost made it always the end goal is, can we be Willow Creek or Saddleback, And at least in my era, those were the big churches that everybody was talking about. Yeah, you know what I mean? So I think sometimes we saw that as the end goal. And I'm saying, no, there's something else. So that's the subversive part in my mind, yeah.
Would you, in that same week, and this is really neat that you use the Passion Week as one of calling into subversive narratives and a dance of protest that connects to...
Oh, I like that. Dance of protest. That's awesome.
That connects to Drew Hart, Dr. Drew Hart, will be on the podcast too.
Awesome.
He leverages out the story of Barabbas on the other end.
That's right.
Would you call the act of Jesus toppling the tables in the temple a subversive act of worship?
Yes. And, it's interesting you say, oh my goodness, Drew is a friend of mine, and that his chapter on Barabbas, that was really something. I hadn't actually worked it out the way he did. I thought it was good. Well, actually, that's where the subtitle of my book comes from. The gospel's power to turn the tables on injustice. So I didn't actually do an exposition of that section, but we thought by putting it in the title, people would be imagining that.
Okay.
So I'm glad that you went there, because I definitely see that as the case. So Jesus upsets the status quo, literally upsets, turns over the tables. And now here's a little thing. We mostly focus on the economics that are happening there. So you get these questions about, oh, is it that they're cheating people out of money and all this stuff? What's really weird is that some New Testament scholars point out that this language of "you've made it a den of thieves" or den of robbers is a word that's often translated insurrectionist. It's the same word that Jesus uses when they come for him in the garden. And he says, look, what was I doing? Am I an insurrectionist? It's the same word that's used for the two guys who got crucified alongside Jesus. The old King James says two robbers or something, or thieves. But it's a word that means people who were against the government. They were insurrectionists. So Jesus, as one scholar, the late Grant Osborne, says, he indicts these folks for using the temple as these are his words, a mafia-like stronghold. So his point is that the temple has lost its function. So when he's upsetting the tables, it's more than just about the money. It's about the way power is being used in Jerusalem there, at least among some religious elite. And if that's true, I'm like, whoa. There's this big indictment that the religious elite are using the church for their own power and purposes. And I think we're seeing that. Jesus upsets those tables. Yeah.
Reverend Dr. Edwards, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a treat to have someone come in with such high credentials and experience and talk to you as a friend. That's affirmation to generations of leaders who are coming up behind the experience and the leadership of Dr. Edwards. Reverend Dr. Edwards. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram, Rev Dr. Dre. So REVDRDRE. You can also find his book, Might from the Margins, wherever fine books are sold, like your local bookstore and not that trash heap, Amazon. This is an episode that I think I'll be coming back to often. I kept it all in 1 hour, but there are key pieces here, both of a glimpse to future leadership, but also a sense for marginalized people of what it means to recenter themselves and to raise their voice, to become mighty from the margins, and basically to create from the margins a new way of being, a new foundation, a reimagination of faith. Well, that's going to be it for season 4, although there are rumors a bonus episode will come out in a month. Rumors. The rumors are true. But Dr. Edwards closes us off here. Thank you so much. You can support this podcast. Check it out, rohadi.com. You can find me at Rohadi on Twitter and rohadi.nagasar on Instagram and Facebook. Please share this podcast far and wide. Let me know what you thought of it. Tell your mom, your mom's friends, your friends, and everybody. That's it for now as we prep up for the bonus episode and also season 5.